Police officer tied to train tracks with a newborn until a little girl and her canine rescued them. Frost turned Denver's rail yard into a field of glass, shards catching the weak spill from sodium lamps as if the night blinked. Officer Daniel Hayes lay cinched to the rails, cuffs hammered shut, breath cutting in and out while iron kissed his wrists. Beside him, a newborn squirmed inside a thin hospital blanket, hiccup, tremor, then a brittle cry that seemed to lift the metal's low hum. Far down the line a horn bellowed, one long predatory note rolling toward them. Hayes twisted until sparks prickled his shoulders. The radio lay cracked, red light pulsing like a heartbeat he could not reach. The rails began to quiver, cold climbed his ribs, a white glow pooled around the bend, pushing shadows forward, stretching them into claws across gravel and steel. Wind carried diesel, wet iron, and bleach. Strip lights fluttered, a sheet of shrink wrap skittered past, snagged, snapped. He angled toward the child. "Stay with me," he whispered, voice frayed, lungs burning. The blanket's corner lifted, exposing a fist the size of a walnut, fingers uncurling, curling again, pleading without words. Movement. Not boots, something lighter. A small figure slipped between pallets. A girl in a patched parka, knit cap low, jaw set, eyes bright with stubborn resolve. Emma Riley. At her heel padded a German shepherd, muscles tight, breath pluming, head cocked, ears spearing the cold. Shadow. Emma dropped beside the lockwork. Gloved fingers found the ratchet, shaking yet relentless. Shadow braced, teeth testing chain, then steel cuffs. The horn screamed nearer, a blade dragged along the spine of the night. Light burst across the yard, swallowing color. Hayes felt the rail vibrate under his cheek and tasted iron as the dog wrenched harder. The girl hissed through her teeth, and the baby answered with a defiant cry. What happened next will shock you. Denver's industrial edge rarely slept. Officer Daniel Hayes knew those blocks as if the grid were etched on his palms. Tall, weathered, mid-30s, he carried a runner's frame softened by years of nights and a face carved more by wind than sun. He wore quite the way others wore rank, a habit born the night an infant vanished from a clinic and a nurse never made it home. The report closed without a body. The ache never did. He stopped talking about luck and started talking about patterns. He tracked plate numbers that lingered near maternity wards, faces that appeared at shelters then disappeared before outreach could catch up, and graffiti marks that migrated along a warehouse chain in neat sequence. Whenever colleagues called it fog, he wrote anyway because fog hides shapes when you wait long enough. Stubbornness made him useful and alone. He understood the price and kept paying it. That morning arrived brittle. Coffee steamed the cruiser windows while a pale sun scratched at the river. An email awaited from an informant who swept floors at a private clinic off Brighton. It carried a photo of a blanket stitched with a tiny lark, a timestamp, an address near the yards, and 3 words on the next line, "Happening again, tonight." Hayes forwarded it to the unit, filed the tip, and requested a discreet watch. He told himself he would hold the perimeter until backup. He meant it when he typed it. By dusk, a low ceiling pressed on the city. The viaduct groaned, and the river smelled like cold iron. A second email arrived from the same sender, a GPS pin near the old switching station, and a still frame clipped from an interior camera. A figure in scrubs carrying a bundle through a service door propped by a mop handle. The lark stitch showed bright at the hem like a signature. Hayes phoned a supervisor, relayed the update, and was told to stage 2 blocks out. He nodded, hung up and turned toward the yards. Emma Riley moved through those blocks as if the streets whispered direction. 9 years old, scrappy and determined, she knew which church pantry set bananas on the back step at dusk, which loading dock kept a vent warm, and which guard let a small girl and a big dog sleep behind a trash corral if they left at first light. Her parka wore more thread than cloth at the elbows. Her mittens had holes where thumbs pressed, and her knit cap had shrunk until it hugged her eyebrows. She classified the city by warmth, shelter, and who kept their word. Shadow kept to her left like a promise. The German shepherd's back carried black, his legs carried mahogany, and muscle lived under the coat like coiled wire. He had belonged to a night watchman who vanished one autumn and never reclaimed him. Emma brought water, then food, then the old blanket that smelled like laundromat soap. Waiting became following. Following became a partnership that didn't ask questions. The dog learned to choose caution until she chose risk, to block strangers with a shoulder, to heel without command, and to keep his mouth gentle even on metal. They spent the afternoon beside a warehouse painted a sickly mint that peeled in long, curling strips. Emma counted trucks. Shadow sniffed antifreeze and lifted his head toward the wind, listening with a focus that made him seem older than his youth. By twilight the rails crusted over, and the sky thinned to a color that erased distance. Bridge, if the vent's cold, Emma told him. He touched her elbow, then stared toward the yards. A horn murmured far off, not a threat yet, only a line clearing its throat. In the switching yard, Hayes parked in dead shadow, killed his headlights and listened. Rails whispered low, a sound he had learned to separate from the hard clatter that meant a live run. This was the hush before. He stepped out and cold cut through his coat along old seam. He moved with the choreography of 100 midnights, left hand grazing the trunk, right hand free, eyes scanning for power company placard. Snow sifted in flour-fine grains. The lattice of tracks threw back dim reflections like a shape unhooked from darker darkness 30 yards ahead, a hooded figure bending over something small. Hayes took 2 measured steps and used the word that carried across interventions without turning into noise. Police. The hood didn't bolt. It tipped up, then placed the bundle on ballast beside a rail with unnerving care, like setting bread in an oven. Hayes started forward, metal kissed bone. Hands were yanked, cuffs detonated tight. A chain looped his belt and found an anchor welded to a Someone behind him moved with professional economy, never hurrying, never wasting motion. A boot pressed his shoulder to gravel, then vanished. The figure drifted back into a seam of shadow and was gone. The bundle shivered, then made a sound too thin to be a cry and too insistent to ignore. The blanket's edge slipped. A newborn's face reddened with cold, mouth open in a silent plea before air arrived. The lark on the hem glinted under the lamp like a seal on a document he had already read. Hayes spoke in a tone used when words matter less than heartbeat. The cuffs cut deeper when he tested them. The chain refused leverage. His radio lay a yard away. Screen spidered from a fall, red diode pulsing as if the device itself were breathing. Emma found the fence patched with plywood that didn't quite meet. A narrow gap let her slide through sideways. She had grown taller, and spaces that once welcomed her had started to resist, so she felt a private victory when she fit. Gravel bit her knees. Shadow followed with a grunt, careful even when hurt. They crossed a strip where weeds wore icy jackets, climbed a short bank to a trestle Zebulon Street's lamps couldn't reach, and paused while air carried diesel, bleach and a copper note that made Emma swallow. Hayes measured distances automatically, rail to rail, tie to tie, where ballast crested, how far the infant lay from his shoulder. He listened for units and heard only the city's night machinery, fans, a far truck, the low tremor of wheels pushing somewhere else. The horn rolled across the lattice and faded, then returned stronger, lining with geometry that told him a southbound would visit this track soon. He thought of the nurse who vanished, the van that never came back, and a corridor that funneled toward a locked door no one would admit existed. The network he had traced through whispers like precision, timing and humiliation. Tonight it had chosen an audience of one and a witness who could not testify. Emma reached the yard's edge and saw the scene in a tilted pool of lamp glow. A man in uniform lay cinched to a rail. A tiny bundle gasped beside him. The dog pressed the chain and tested its give without panic. Emma slid down the bank on her side to keep from skidding and landed hard enough to bite her tongue. "Shadow," she said. "Point." The shepherd moved to the officer's hands, mouth gentle on metal, jaw working with purpose. Emma's fingers found the cuff housing. Her breath fogged the hinge. Hayes turned his body to shelter the infant from spindrift and glare. The lark's stitch looked even brighter up close. He counted time by breath because seconds stretched and folded like tin. Across the yard the horn swelled again, closer now, vibrating the air in pulses that gathered into a steady shake. Light seeped around the bend, turning frost into glitter that looked festive until the sound told the truth. Echoes bounced between warehouse walls and stretched minutes thin. Hayes spoke to the baby, voice steady, building calm he barely felt. He told a child too new to know language that help was here, and would not leave. The ring he had traced for months was not a rumor for budget or prey. It lived here, patient enough to stage a lesson and cruel enough to use a newborn as a prop. That realization should have bent him. Instead it clarified. Someone on the other side of this line would be moving vans, phones and names while a locomotive shouldered the curve. Someone had watched him log plates, smiled at his notes and chosen tonight to decide whether he carried stubbornness or grace. Steel began to sing. The ground answered with a tremor that climbed from stone to bone. Emma's shoulders shook, yet her hands steady. Shadow's breath came in white ropes. Hayes felt warmth seep through his sleeve from the bundle and understood the size of the ask. He drew a careful breath, tasted cold iron and fixed his eyes on the girl and the dog who had stepped from darkness as if the city itself had sent them. Somewhere behind the glow weight approached. Somewhere ahead choices narrowed to a line thin as frost. He remembered the old case like the shape of a missing tooth, tongue fur. In that winter, a security guard reported a cleaner pushing a cart that rattled too hard for mops. No one checked it before it was loaded at the loading dock. 2 cameras blinked out at the same time. A van rolled away with plates masked by mud. When Hayes assembled the pieces, the hallway smelled like antiseptic and fear, and the nursery windows reflected his face. That failure tightened every choice afterward. It was why he tracked larks on hems and watched doors meant for It was why he angled toward the yards even when policy said wait. Emma's presence near the tracks also had a history she never offered. She knew the yard's timings, the pockets where wind collected, and the places where heat leaked through. Shadow learned with her, memorizing routes that began as survival and became instinct. Shadow planted his paws on the rail and leaned until muscle shook. The cuff teeth clicked against his molars. He eased, shifted, bit again, finding the slot by instinct. Emma dropped at the other wrist. Her hands shook. Numb fingers fought the latch. The horn wailed beyond the bend. Metal answered with a deepening hum. Officer Daniel Hayes drew his elbows tight to guard the newborn from flying grit. Shadow, Emma whispered. Belief more than command. The dog adjusted. He pawed the hinge, braced and dragged the chain along the tie. Links scraped. Sparks winked and died. Hayes tested slack. Little. Not enough. He bent to breathe warmth across the blanket. A thin cry sliced the yard, stubborn and alive. Emma pulled a pin from her cap. She slid it into the notch and jiggled. Nothing. She reversed. A click. Almost. She jiggled again. The horn screamed closer, flattening everything else. Her gloves snagged. She tore them off and used her raw fingers. Skin split. Blood-streaked chrome. She twisted. The cuff stuttered and held. She drew a breath and tried again. Shadow shifted sides, jaw working with slow force. Teeth on steel, tongue pushed aside. He bit the smallest piece that wouldn't break enamel. The chain flexed. The anchor groaned, but held. Hayes brushed ballast from the swaddled child. The blanket had ridden up. He nudged it down with numb knuckles. The infant's chest trembled, a hiccup, then a raft. Hayes spoke low. Stay. Fight. Stay. Light licked the curve. It crawled along rails like spilled milk. Ballast hopped in tiny skips. A gust slapped them with diesel and wet iron. Emma swallowed. She found the catch again. Her world narrowed to a hole, a pin, a memory. The cuff moved a fraction. Not enough. The horn roared as if the night had lungs. Hayes jerked his right hand. Pain flared. The ring tightened and slipped a hair. He pulled again and felt skin split. Warmth slicked his wrist in the metal. He used the slide. The cuff yielded a whisper. Not free yet. A bright beam flooded the yard, bleaching everything to paper. Left. Left, Emma said to Shadow, still working the spring. The dog pivoted and seized the chain near the cuff, tugging as if playing but steady. The latch trembled. Emma rotated the pin. A tiny spring sighed. The cuff opened with a startled chirp. Hayes snapped his elbow back. One hand free. He threw his weight over the bundle. His other wrist held. The engine loomed. Shadow leaped to the second cuff. Paws scraped frost. Claws rasped steel. He pressed his chest to Hayes's forearm and worked the hinge with grinding patience. Emma shifted to the chain anchor. She pulled, slipped and pulled again, breath ragged. The anchor did not care. She jammed a pallet shard under the loop. Wood barked. Bolt held. The horn drilled the air. Hayes shoved his freed hand under the newborn, lifting to make a pocket against the wind. Tears burned in the beam. Gravel rattled. The train rounded the bend, huge, inevitable, so close the rails sang like a struck bell. Emma rammed the wedge deeper. The loop rose a fraction. Shadow's teeth slipped, then found purchase. He twisted, metal squealed. The cuff teeth skipped a groove. Hayes yanked. Steel bit him again and gave half an inch. Skin tore wider, more warmth. He used it. He pulled with everything he could bribe. He felt the minute he bought. He spent it. Emma shoved a rock under the gap to lock the game. Again she told herself. The bolt moaned, and rose another breath. Shadow kept grinding. The band on Hayes's arm trembled like a live thing. The baby cried louder now, a rasp that scraped the heart. The headlights swallowed distance. Air churned into fists. Hayes pressed his mouth near the infant's ear. Hold. He timed a pull to the vibration's peak. The cuff slid uselessly. He changed angle, bracing with his knee against the far rail. Something clicked in his shoulder. He ignored it and dragged as Shadow ran. The clasp spit, jammed, then slipped a notch with a sound like a sob. Emma's pin snapped. She didn't stop. She found a nail beside the tie, and used that. Slivers of motion shaved fractions into inches. The world went white and loud and cold. A wheel screamed beyond a switch, proof that the next seconds would not forgive mistakes. Now, Hayes barked, not in panic but a beat. Shadow heaved with his shoulders jerking, then steady pressure, then another jerk. The cuff rotated the wrong way, then right. Click. Not open. Click. Almost. Emma drove the nail into the spring, and felt it nudge. She pressed. The cuff split like a mouth gasping. Hayes ripped his arm free. He did not stand. He rolled around the newborn, hooked an elbow under the bundle, and shoved off the rail with his hip. The chain caught his belt and snapped him back. He hit the tie with his ribs. Air fled. He tried again. The chain held, a leash tied to the anchor. Emma fought. Shadow tucked his muzzle, cinched the blanket and kept the wind from stripping it away. The beam swamped the yard and swallowed the dog's outline. Emma screamed at the bolt and pulled. She felt each thread move. Shadow planted and pulled too, turning leverage into a choreographed wrench. Hayes latched the chain with torn hands and heaved toward Emma, giving her slack to work. The loop rose. The bolt crawled. The train roared. The anchor cleared half the plate. Emma yanked again. It stuck. She tucked her shoulder and dragged in a long grinding pull that felt like moving a wall. Something was released with a brittle crack. The loop jumped free. The chain slithered like a cut snake. Go, Hayes barked. He scooped the infant, cradled close, and rolled off the tie. He clutched the child and surged for the slope. Shadow shoved at his hip like a teammate. Emma grabbed Hayes's sleeve and hauled. They moved as a tangle that knew one direction. They reached the lip as the engine arrived. Wind became a shove. Gravel rose. The horn saturated every cell. Hayes dove, twisting to keep the infant wrapped inside his body. Emma flat. Shadow threw himself across both of them, ribs heaving, head down, ears pinned. Heat and force raked the air as the locomotive tore past, metal screaming and thunder rolling over flesh. Frost sand exploded and rained down. They did not move for 5 heartbeats. Hayes lifted his head first, breath leaving, and then returning in ragged parcels. The horn trailed, cars clattered by, still a river, no longer a blade. He uncurled by degrees and checked the infant. Tiny chest lifted, fell, lifted again. The cry returned, thin but stubborn. He closed his eyes once and opened them with discipline. Emma lay on her back, panting for breath. Her fingers bled. She stared at the white stream of boxcars, then at the hinge that had cut her. She swallowed and pushed herself up. Shadow leaned his weight against Hayes and then against her, checking both with quick touches of his nose. He sat finally, tongue out, eyes steady. Hayes passed the infant to Emma for a breath, while he tested his shoulder. Hot pain promised later protest. He took the child back, tucked him tighter, and shook blood from his hand. He looked at Emma. She met his gaze without blinking. Have you ever faced a moment where courage was all you had? The question threaded the cold without breaking it. A quiet chord under the wrap. Emma wiped her nose and stood. We have to move, she said. The train masked other sounds, but not all. Somewhere, a door slammed. Somewhere else, Gravel shifted under shoes that did not belong by accident. Shadow's ears tipped toward the pallet yard. Hayes followed the angle and saw nothing, which worried him more than seeing something. He rose. His legs argued. He told them no. He pressed the newborn closer and gestured toward the breach in the fence. Emma took point, keeping Shadow trotted tight to her heel, head swinging left, right, left, reading the air. They slid down the far side of the embankment and found the narrow gap. Emma slipped through first. Shadow pushed after, careful not to jostle the child. Hayes angled the bundle through and followed, scraping his shoulders raw on plywood. They crouched behind stacked drums and waited while the last cars rattled past. The yard exhaled. The horn receded. Night returned in pieces. Hayes listened for sirens. None yet. He tasted old fear and new purpose. He looked at the girl with torn fingers and the dog with steel on his tongue, and knew the rescue had bought time, and something else, a living link between stubborn lines on paper, and allies the city had raised when no one watched. Good work, he said, voice low. It was not enough. It was what he had. Emma nodded once. Shadow leaned into her hip. The newborn fussed and settled. The rails cooled behind them. Ahead, the dark held footsteps and answers. Hayes squared his shoulders against pain. He led them toward the alley that would hide them for the next move. They moved, quick and low, toward the light that promised help, a clinic sign flickering beyond stacked crates, where answers might wait, or enemies, and where the night would test whether rescue could become just. Antiseptic sting floated in the corridor like a thin veil. Fluorescent panels hummed, steady, while monitors stitched soft beeps through the room. Officer Daniel Hayes surfaced with a dry throat and bandaged wrists, gauze scratching where the steel had bitten. A bassinet stood close enough to touch. The newborn slept under a knit cap, breath-puffing faint clouds that dissolved in warm air. Daniel let his hand hover above the rim, afraid to break something fragile by pressing too hard on anything within reach. He breathed, slow and careful, until the ache in his shoulder settled into ordinary pain. A nurse with silver frames stepped in, checked vitals and raised the bed a notch. Her badge read Vega. She spoke with calm economy, asked about pain, adjusted a line, then set a warmed bottle near the heater. "You're safe," she said, as if reading a line from a ledger. Daniel nodded, eyelids heavy, mind brightening around one fixed point. The child lived. Diesel was gone, cold gone, chain gone. Even so, echoes rattled behind his ribs. Footsteps paused outside. Emma Riley lingered at the threshold, eyes wide under a borrowed hoodie. Shadow padded at her knee, nails whispering over tile, nose sorting antiseptic, soap, plastic, warmed formula, and old coffee. Fresh gauze wrapped her torn fingers. In her palm lay a small gift, a bracelet braided from 3 thin strands, blue yarn, a pale shoelace, and a longer brown thread pulled from her cuff. She held it like a promise. Daniel lifted a hand in welcome. Words arrived, plain and unadorned. "You saved us." Emma dipped her head as if the sentence weighed more than she could accept alone, stepped to the tray, and set the bracelet beside the water cup. "For the baby," she said, then after a breath, "or you, if it." Shadow rested his chin on the mattress, and stared at Daniel with measured attention, as if checking that both pulse and gratitude existed. Vega returned, lifted the newborn, and fit the bottle to a searching mouth. The first pull was fierce, the second found rhythm. Emma watched, jaw unclenching by degrees, shoulders dropping as relief settled. Shadow inched closer to catch the milk's faint warmth. Daniel traced the bassinet's edge, and felt something loosen inside that hadn't loosened in years. They spoke little. Beeps filled the gaps along with hallway wheels and an elevator chime that came and went like a tide. Snow freckled the window. Plastic ivy climbed a poster listing rules in friendly fonts. Daniel studied Emma's hands and the neat white wraps. She saw the concern before he could phrase it. "They'll heal," she said. "Hurts when I try to twist too fast." He tried a smile and found it real. "Do you have somewhere safe tonight?" he asked. Emma's glance slid to Shadow. "Safer with him than without. No drama, just math." He nodded. "We can talk to a caseworker," he offered. "Only if you want." Consent mattered more than impulse. He framed questions as open doors and left them open. A chaplain stopped by, left a quiet line like bread on a table. Sometimes God sends the right people at the right second. Daniel did not argue. He had been pinned to iron with a life pressed to his heart. A child and a dog had stepped out of the night and bought time with grit. Doubt and gratitude stood side by side and reached a workable truce. Emma had eaten almost nothing. Vega conjured a tray from a friendly cafeteria crew, soup steaming in a white bowl, a warm roll, an orange and a square of brownie. Emma ate with unembarrassed focus. Shadow waited until Daniel offered a small piece of bread on an open palm. He took it with ceremonial care and settled again at the bed's foot. A patrol officer poked his head in, nodded at Daniel and on reflex scratched Shadow behind one ear. The shepherd accepted the courtesy like an old friend greeting a new shift and blinked with solemn approval. The baby finished, sighed and drowsed. Vega showed Emma how to fold the blanket edge under the shoulder to block draft. Emma copied the tuck perfectly, then checked it twice, light hands sure despite bandage. Daniel watched the tiny fist open and close, then felt a finger clamp his thumb with unexpected strength. The grip sent heat up his arm, a small benediction disguised as reflex. They outlined practical steps. Detectives would come. A statement here, more questions later. Staff would run labs, track temperature and log every breath. Emma asked whether the men behind the yard might try again. Daniel refused the lie of certainty. "We'll plan," he said. "We'll move smart. We won't give them clean angles." She weighed the answer and nodded once, satisfied by respect more than by promises. Afternoon softened to a dim, kind light. The room smelled of lemon sanitizer over cotton. Warm air hissed through a vent and fluttered the blanket corner. From the next bay came a sharp newborn wail, short and outraged, followed by silence. Life here measured victory in ounces, minutes and steady lines on screens. Daniel's chest loosened enough to make room for breath that didn't hurt. Emma drifted to the window. Frost traced ferns along the lower pane where heat met glass. Tracks curled beyond the buildings like pale ropes and vanished into haze. Shadow joined her, nose tapping the light once. Then still, without looking away, Emma spoke to the glass or to herself or to anyone who might need it. Who in your life needs a reminder they're not alone? The words hung, gentle and sincere. Daniel let them land. He asked whether she might return tomorrow. "I'll need a professional opinion on names," he said, tilting his head toward the basin. Emma considered, then gave one solemn nod. "Names should mean something," she said. "A principle rather than a preference. Maybe something about light, or rescue, or staying." Daniel stored the ideas like equipment he would need soon. Evening gathered. Vega dimmed overhead panels to a softer hue, tucked a heavier blanket over the sleeping child, and placed a small stuffed lamb at the corner. A plain hospital gift that made the bassinet feel less like equipment and more like a crate. Emma touched the stitched ear, then slid the braided bracelet through the handle and tied a neat knot. She tugged 3 times, testing. It held. Silence grew companionable. Daniel tried to arrange his thanks into a speech and failed, so he set words down simply. "You were steady when everything shook." Emma's answer was a shy lift of one shoulder and a glance toward Shadow. The dog thumped his tail once, then resumed his watch, eyes half-lidded yet alert. Loyalty looked like rest with attention alive beneath. A sergeant from Daniel's unit arrived close to shift change, left paperwork on a clipboard, and parked a uniform outside the door. He kept his visit short, understanding that this hour belonged to quiet. He squeezed Daniel's shoulder, tipped 2 fingers to Emma in a gesture that took her seriously, and called Shadow partner in a tone without condescension. The shepherd accepted the promotion without comment. Dusk pressed its face to the glass. Streetlights bloomed. Night held them gently, promising morning and steadier breaths ahead. Morning slid into the precinct with cold light and coffee. Daniel signed discharge papers early, wrist bandages under sleeves, shoulder taped and resolved sharper than pain. Emma waited by a vending machine, Shadow at her boots. Printers chattered, phones rang, a rail map glittered. Daniel set the blanket from the yard on clean paper. A lark stitched at the corner caught fluorescent glare. Near the hem, a faint patch tasted of formula the hospital did not stock. He opened an evidence jar from a month-old case, a scrap from a clinic storeroom where cameras failed for 9 minutes. He let Shadow smell both. The dog's ears tipped. Certainty took hold. They stepped into the back lot. Frost turned asphalt to crushed glass. Emma clipped a lead to Shadow's harness. The dog pressed his nose into the blanket, huffed and chose a path toward a chain-link gate. He paused at a rusty latch, then pulled left down a service alley. Daniel kept pace despite the tape's tug. Emma read the tale like compass ticks. The alley fed a lane lined with pallets, dumpsters and soot-coated brick. Shadow checked a pole, circled a drain, then set a course past a mural where a hawk peeled across faded blue. At a fence patched with tin he nosed a scene where someone had cut a hinge and bent it back. Grease smudged the edge. Daniel photographed, logged and followed. Yards opened toward the river. Oil and faint sweetness rode the air. Shadow angled north and stopped at a loading bay with a broken padlock. Emma traced a chipped heel in dust. Daniel bagged a rubber flake. Inside, stale air pooled around a forklift. Boxes marked cleaning supplies lined a wall from the same chain. Front company, Daniel said, taking shots. Emma drifted to a door stenciled employees only. At hip height, a faint chalk sign crossed two lines over a small circle. Same mark near the clinic, she murmured. He documented the symbol and texted an analyst who tracked quiet codes. The door opened into a corridor where bleach fought mildew. A concrete stair slanted to a half-basement. Shadow hesitated, then descended, nose low. The room held crack tubs, a coil of hose, and paper slips. Emma eased a receipt from under a brick. Midnight timestamp. The discount store is 6 blocks west. Items: bottle brush, thermal wraps, pacifiers, bargain formula. Daniel photographed and bagged it. Outside, wind chased grip. A train moaned on a distant line. Shadow tugged again, threading alleys, crossing a salted road, slipping under a bent crossing arm, and stopping at a storage yard rimmed with razor wire. A manager blinked at the badge, unlocked a unit, and stepped aside when the shepherd whined. Air rolled out with syrup and plastic. Bins labeled by month lined the walls. A folding table sat by a small heater. On it lay another blanket folded neatly, the same lark stitched at the edge, fabric stiff with dried formula. Daniel's hand steadied when the camera began to work. Shadow dipped to a tray dusted with powder, sneezed and pawed a corner until a cheap phone slid into view. Gloves on, Daniel bagged the device and battery separately. He searched the bins while Emma read stickers aloud. None matched last night. A ledger listed deliveries by code: rail, west, dock, clinic and bridge. Several rows carried a nicked triangle. He captured every page. Pain trembled through his bandage when he closed the cover. He asked for footage and promised a return with a warrant. Outside, wind scoured the Shadow faced south, nose tasting scent on the breeze. He set off across frost-crusted weeds toward a street where boarded windows squinted under sagging gutters. Emma logged porches, tracks and fresh tire grooves. They passed a church offering soup on Thursdays and a row of houses stripped of copper. Shadow slowed at a mesh gate and pressed pause to the wire. He nosed a crack at the hinge. Daniel pinched a tuft of pale fiber snagged on a point, the same thread as the lark blankets, and slid it into a paper fold. Above the door a camera blinked a dead red eye. He tried the handle, locked. They worked around the block to a rear alley boxed by dumpsters. A ground-level window breathed warm air scented with formula, bleach and cologne. Emma lifted the sash an inch, then another. Daniel held his badge under the gap and announced their presence, voice even. Silence. He peered. A room the size of a box truck held a cot, a cooler, 2 crates of linens, a duffel and a corkboard pinned with schedules. He read half a list before a floorboard creaked. He withdrew and motioned Emma back. The door opened a fraction, then shut. Shadow growled. Tires hissed close by. A white van rolled without headlights. Daniel sprinted, memorizing plate digits gummed with grime. 3V, maybe P, then 48. He shouted for the unit near the corner. A cruiser swung wide. The van shot through a stop and vanished into a cutout lane. Siren rose, then faded. Emma dropped to one knee where the van had idled. She lifted her palm from the gravel and showed a faint smear, sticky and sweet. Shadow pushed his nose along the track the tires had traced. Daniel watched the shepherd choose a heading toward a south spur and mapped the grid. A yard over the river. A cul-de-sac with 2 warehouses. A dead end that still saw trucks at odd hours. They followed under a sky hammered from tin. Fences rattled. Dogs barked from porch. A billboard peeled in strips that slapped rhythm. Shadow drew them to low buildings painted beige that had promised storage and microbrews before promising nothing. One roller door wore a fresh chain. Another had been cut and wired back with baling wire. Daniel pressed an ear to steel and heard a soft mechanical pulse. He called it in, voice low, giving cross streets and a summary possible stash. Evidence of infants processed. Van fleeing east. Request for backup to approach slowly. Units rolled. Emma pulled her hood. Shadow leaned into the seam and breathed. Daniel scanned rooftops and alleys for watchers. Sirens threaded the distance. Wind hissed through weeds. Emma stood beside him, knuckles raw under wraps. They plan routes like puzzles, she said. They leave crumbs to keep us busy while they slide the cake out the back. He nodded. Then we take both doors. Shadow stiffened, then nudged left toward a narrow path between cinder block and fence. The scent pooled there, fresh, edged with sour milk. Daniel pictured a prep area, a cooler and blank forms waiting for names that belonged to no one. He set his feet and waited for the first cruiser to turn the corner. What would you risk to uncover the truth? The thought arrived without ceremony. He glanced at Emma and saw the answer in her eyes. Sirens grew louder, brakes sighed, radios cracked. Daniel raised a hand, counted down from 3 and prepared to move with the team when they arrived. A wounded cop, a sharp child and a loyal dog at the point where a city's shadow either thinned or doubled. Pines thickened as the road narrowed, a cracked ribbon threading frost and shadow toward a ridge of pale light. Daniel drove, shoulder taped, wrists bandaged. Emma leaned forward, scanning the tree line. The lead was a ledger stamped with codes and a note, "Cabin tonight." The same hand that drew rail symbols had written it. An analyst traced supply purchases to a retired nurse. Ellen Harper, east of the foothills, charity, the paperwork claimed. Daniel did not trust that word when it traveled with midnight deliveries and dead cameras. They turned down a gravel spur. A thin plume rose from a tin chimney. The cabin crouched among boulders, porch sinking, roof thatched with needles, steps slick with moss. A cross hung by the door. On the lintel, knife-cut lines crossed a circle, the same sign chalked in city storage. Daniel steadied his breath. He parked under a ponderosa and cut the engine. Quiet arrived like a hand laid flat. Shadow dropped from the SUV and stood, nostrils flaring. Emma pulled her cap low and flexed bandaged fingers. "Ask first," Daniel said. "Don't accuse," she called without calling. Emma answered. They climbed the steps. The door opened before knuckles met wood. A woman in a faded cardigan filled the frame, hair pinned with clips, worry stitched between her brows. Her gaze took in the badge, bandages, girl, dog, then slid toward the fire. "I know why you're here," she said. "You tracked the blankets." "Miss Harper," Daniel said, palms visible, "may we come in?" "No names," she replied quickly. "Phones, listen." Inside smelled of wood smoke, coffee and faint antiseptic. A copper kettle hissed on a stove. Shadow made a slow circuit. Emma drifted to a plate where an index card lay under a stone. 3 deliveries were written, then crossed out, underneath prayer. Ellen wrapped a shawl with a nurse's precise motion. "I turned away," she said. At first they sounded like saying, "Unclaimed infants are placed in safe homes. Donations are handled by a foundation." Then a mother stood at dawn with an empty blanket. I followed the paper and hit a wall labeled efficiency. My locker wore a symbol, next shift. I stopped sleeping. Daniel let the quiet work. "I opened a storage closet," she said. "Not samples, tags, blankets with the stitched label, a cooler that never held blood draws. When I asked, they moved my hours and called me tired. I told myself to leave. Leaving felt like mercy. It was fear with a ribbon." Emma looked toward the door. Shadow's ears pricked. Gravel ticked on the porch, a test of weight. Then stillness. The kettle hissed. Fire cracked. Daniel shifted to the window in the hall. "Who did you call?" he asked. "The subcontractor," she said. "He sent a boy in a new suit." He smiled, handed pills, took boxes and told me to pray. "When?" "3 nights ago. They move in rhythms. Another pickup soon." I copied a ledger when doors stayed open. "Then show us," Emma said. Ellen led them down a dim hall. The back room held a cot. a metal cabinet and a wall painted muted green. Chalk symbols marched in rows. The slanted X over a circle, 3 short slashes, a triangle, then initials and dates. Some entries had been wiped and retraced. Assignments Ellen's X over circle is clinic handoff. Slashes are rail storage. Triangle is westbound. Initials match drivers or guards. Shadow nosed the baseboard and whined. Emma tugged the rug aside and found a hatch with a simple latch. Daniel lifted. Cold air spiraled from a crawl space that smelled like dust and alcohol. A duffel sat on cinder blocks. A red cross stenciled crudely on its side. He pulled it up and unzipped. Slang, gauze, syringes, thermal wraps, baby caps, 3 blankets with the lax stitch. A thin ledger and a bag of tags lay inside. The air above the kit tasted of alcohol and sugar. "You kept this," Daniel said. "I told myself I needed proof," Ellen replied. "Truth. I feared burning it." Daniel opened the ledger. Neat columns listed codes, dates and totals. At the bottom a note in a different pen cabin. "Tonight, 9. He sealed the book. Emma's eyes lifted toward the door before sound reached them. Footsteps brushed the porch. 2 soft scrapes. Pause. Shadow lowered his head and let a rumble build. Emma raised a palm. The rumble condensed. Knuckles tapped once, twice. A pleasant voice followed. "Miss Harper, we brought supplies. Cold night ahead." Ellen stood still. "Come tomorrow," she called. "Schedules shifted," the man said. "Quick signature and we're gone." The knob turned a fraction. Wood creaked. Daniel set his shoulder to the frame. He lifted a small camera. Emma slid behind the counter, phone ready. Shadow settled at the hinge, eyes on the seam of light. Silence held. Boots scuffed. A second voice. "Leave it on the step." Paper rustled. Tires creaked near a truck. The first voice sighed. "Tomorrow then." Footfalls retreated. An engine rolled away. Emma exhaled. Daniel waited, then moved. Snow dust along the porch held shallow prints. He lifted a clear strip where a rectangle had brushed the door. On the stoop a tote lay open to diapers and formula with a triangle sticker. He photographed and latched it. Inside, Ellen pressed both palms to the table. "They test for weakness," she said. "See who They learned nothing new," Daniel answered. "We learned enough." He nodded toward the chalk wall and the duffel. "Will you testify?" Her jaw worked once. "Yes. Names when I have them. Symbols when I don't. I can describe the boy. I can tell you who blessed the door when they started." "We'll keep you guarded," Daniel said. "You will not stand alone." Emma moved to the window. Snow sifted. Shadow leaned into her leg. "We stage tonight," Daniel said. 9 on the ledger. "We sit quietly on the road. If they come with a tote, we follow west." He looked at Ellen. "Anything else?" She swallowed. "Phone under the trunk's false bottom. Numbers I never dialed." Emma helped slide the trunk. Daniel found the panel, lifted it and bagged a cheap phone and a card inked with initials matched to code names. Signal dead. They set the plan as light thinned. Ellen would stay inside. A deputy would park down the ridge. Daniel, Emma, and Shadow would wait along a cut near a fallen pine where moss draped the roots. Cameras would watch the porch and the lane. If the truck returned, they would record faces and plates. If pressed, the deputy would light them. If the flight, a second unit would net the switchback. Ellen gripped the shawl. "I did harm by waiting," she said. "I want to do good by standing." "Standing counts," Daniel replied. "Mercy does too." They stepped onto the porch. Cold wrapped them. Daniel looked at trees, the cross by the door, and the sign cut into wood, and felt the investigation narrow to a line as frost. They moved to the cut and settled into the hush, watched by a forest that holds secrets the way hospitals hold night without sleep, without judgment, waiting for someone to choose light over cover. Wind stiffened, dragging needles across the roof. The ridge held a bruised sky. Daniel crouched behind the fallen pine, shoulder taped, eyes on the porch lamp. Ellen left dim. Emma lay beside him, hat low, breath fogging. Shadow pressed into her hip, ears pivoting. A foot grazed grit. Stillness. Another scrape, farther left. Daniel lifted 2 fingers. Hold. The forest answered with a dry snap that wasn't wind. Nothing moved, yet everything felt close. Ellen's phone vibrated on the table. She had placed it face down after they set up the cameras. It buzzed again, longer. She flipped it, stared at an unknown number, and looked toward the window. The screen threw cold square across her knuckles. She answered. "Don't open the door," a man said, smooth. "Wrong. We saw your lamp." "I'm resting," she replied. "That's good. Keep resting. We'll take the load." "No signature. New schedule." "No signatures?" she asked. "Not tonight. Leave the tote. Go to bed." A pause. "Phones, listen." The line died. Ellen reached for the shawl. Her hands shook. Outside, tires whispered, then stopped. Daniel's radio hissed. He kept it low, fed coordinates to the deputy down the ridge. Emma touched his sleeve. Shadow rumbled once, a growl like a current through soil. The dog's gaze cut toward the right flank. A silhouette slid across the porch window. Quick. Test. Another crossed the corner of the cabin, taller, shoulders hunched. A third hovered near the chimney and vanished. Daniel counted. 3, at least. He pulled Emma closer behind the root, whispering, "Stay down." A soft knock tapped on the door. Not polite, not urgent, just ownership. Ellen stood in the hall, jaw clenched. She moved to the chalk wall and wrote a hidden name, V. Kane. She killed the lamp and let darkness take over the room. Another call, same number. "Lights off," the man said. "Very smart. We're here to help you rest. Hand over the box." "You said tomorrow," she replied. "We changed our minds. Open now." She stepped back and said, "There's a child." Silence. Then a laugh. "We counted 3 heartbeats." The voice replied. "A man, a girl, a dog. Sweet trio. Send them away." Ellen whispered, "You're not clergy." "Open, Ellen. Don't make a prayer into a sin." Daniel squeezed Emma's shoulder. Plan B. He keyed the radio and requested lights on the ridge in 30 seconds. The deputy confirmed. Daniel pointed at the east window. Emma crawled toward the slope, careful not to silhouette against the snow. Shadow flowed with her. Glass ticked. A wedge lifted the sash a fraction. Cold rolled in. A gloved hand reached inside, feeling for the latch. Ellen tapped the copper kettle with a spoon. The ping rang like a bell in the fog. The hand paused. Another tried the knob. Locked. Branches cracked behind the cabin. Heavy, deliberate. Someone is cutting the flank. Frost glittered, then fell as a boot brushed a lower bough. Daniel adjusted his angle, sighting along the rail. He saw a sleeve, a patch without markings. The figure lifted a pry bar. Floodlights blew open the ridge. White poured through the trees, carving shadows into spears. Men flinched. Daniel surged from the log, crossed the clearing, and took the steps in 2 jumps. "Police." His voice was steel. "Hands." 2 shapes bolted right. A third spun left. The one at the window ducked. Ellen clicked the deadbolt and stepped away from the line of fire. Daniel shouldered the jam, weapon down. He saw a face for one breath. The man grinned and tossed the bar into the snow. "You brought a congregation," he said, eyes flicking toward the road. Tires on gravel signaled the deputy blocking the lane. Emma reached the corner and froze, unseen, counting. Shadow held against her leg. Silent. She watched a 4th silhouette detach from the trees and slide toward the back step. He carried a tote. He wore camp boots and a washed cap. He checked his watch and kept moving. Daniel stepped sideways, keeping the door between himself and the left flank. "This is finished." He said. "Walk away and explain yourself in a lit room." "Lit rooms turn truth into stories," the grinning man answered. "We write better." "Not tonight." Daniel signaled Shadow. The shepherd launched and hit the tote carrier's thigh, knocking him sideways. Emma darted forward, grabbed the strap and dragged it beyond reach. The man swung an elbow and met a girl who ducked. He stumbled. Shadow pinned wrist to dirt, teeth bared but controlled. The grinning man came off the rail and rushed down. The officer sidestepped, twisted and slammed him chest first into a post. Daniel wrenched an arm behind the man's back and snapped a cuff over the wrist bone. The second wrist fought, then failed when the deputy's beam found them. Steel clicked. The man sat. A second attacker lunged from the left. Emma saw him too late. He grabbed her hood and jerked. Shadow abandoned his hold an instant, wheeled and blasted into the man's knee. The assailant dropped. The dog returned to the first while Emma scrambled behind a stump. The window hand pushed through and lifted the latch. A masked figure began climbing inside. Ellen stepped forward with a broom and cracked it across her forearm and temple in a practiced motion. The intruder bounced off the sill and landed in the snow, stunned long enough for the deputy to apply restraints. Silence held. Then a fifth shadow broke from cover near the chimney and sprinted for the truck. Daniel saw a jawline, a scar, something to match later. The engine turned over, tires spun, and carried the truck toward the switchback. "Block!" Daniel shouted. The deputy fishtailed across the lane, nose to nose with the fleeing grill. Doors flew open. More lights. Voices. The truck shuddered, then stopped. A man slid out and sank to his knees, hands open. Daniel looked for Emma. She stood beside Shadow, chest heaving, eyes bright, hands steady despite bandages. He ordered medics and reported numbers. 5 detained. No shots. Minor injuries. Secured scene. Ellen opened the door and stepped onto the porch. "You asked for more," she said. "I gave names, I hid. I held the door closed. I hit when I had to." Daniel nodded. "You told the truth fast." Sirens threaded through the trees. The tote lay open, filled with diapers, formula, and tags. Emma picked up a tag. Blank lines waited for data that would have erased a lot. She slipped it into an evidence bag. The grinning man watched from the floor, cuffed. "This was nothing," he said. "You grabbed runners. That's echo." Daniel crouched. Echoes lead to walls. Walls lead to doors. He removed the man's cap and studied his face. "Tell me about the door." The man smiled and said nothing. Detectives from the town entered the ring of light. Camera shutters whispered. Daniel stood and stepped toward Emma and Shadow. The forest creaked. The ridge held. Inside, chalk symbols waited, along with a ledger naming a time. Tonight, 9. The confrontation ended without a grave. It began something larger. Daniel steadied under the weight, knowing the next move would demand precision, patience, and a mercy that never mistook softness for surrender. Metal rasped under boots as the team slipped through a gap in the fence and angled toward a warehouse hunched beside the rail yard. Diesel rode the wind through broken panes. A sour milk reek drifted from vents. From inside, a thin cry rose, clipped, returned. Daniel raised a fist. Emma hid behind pallets. Shadow flattened under a dock lip, eyes bright, breath steady. Yard lights skimmed rails, then vanished. "Left entry," Daniel whispered. "Catwalk above, office window." Bandages bit when he moved, yet resolve held. Detectives circled the rear, the deputy idled dark a block out. Dispatch staged medics. Silence, then a clatter deep in the bay. A steel door wore fresh scratches. A keypad blinked red. Emma studied scraped paint. "Meg catch," she mouthed. Daniel levered a pry bar. Shadow sniffed the seam. The latch sighed. Hinges wept. Cold fluorescent glare poured over rows of cages stacked 3 high. Lark blankets sat folded on a table. Formula tins towered beside boxes of tags waiting for names. An infant wailed from the far corner, answered by another, then another. The team moved. "Clear left," Daniel said. He took aisle 1. Emma swept right. Shadow ghosted the center like a current. A guard stepped from behind a crate, pistol low. Shadow launched, crashed into the wrist, and sent the weapon skittering. Emma shoved the crate, pinning the man long enough for cuffs. Gunfire erupted from the catwalk. Rounds sparked along railings. Daniel slid behind a column and dragged a cage to shield a cradle. "Hold," he said to the tiny face inside. A smooth voice floated from the office window. "Officer Hayes, you keep finding my workstations." Victor Kane leaned on the sill, grin small. "Still taped together." "Surrender," Daniel said. "Here isn't an ending," Kane replied. He lifted a remote. Sirens howled from hidden speakers. Strobes hammered vision. 2 guards burst through an interior door, firing short bursts that chewed paint. Daniel counted beats, moved on the 3rd, hugging steel. Emma crawled, yanked a power cord and punched one light bank dark. Shadow cut angles, drew fire, vanished behind columns, reappeared at a flank, slammed knees, bought seconds. Daniel closed, stripped a rifle, and cuffed. Bullets stitched concrete near Emma. Dust leapt. She rolled to the console wired to cages. A key dangled. She twisted. Latches popped in pairs while she murmured to tiny faces. Voice steady. Kane's voice returned. You keep the infants, I keep the routes. Smoke hissed from vents, acrid and quick. Daniel threw her a filter and pulled one on. Shadow sneezed, then pushed through the haze toward a soft cry under a tarp. He found a second line of carriers, smaller, colder, almost silent. He barked one. Daniel sliced tape, lifted lids and found dull eyes. He shrugged off his jacket, wrapped 2 bundles, and handed one to Emma. Warm this. More shots raked the floor. Daniel fired twice. A shooter dropped. Sprinklers coughed, then poured. Smoke mixed with water into sour rain. Emma dialed dispatch, voice clean. Infant recovery in progress, smoke deployed. West door compromised, pediatric units required. She flipped to the precinct, Unit 7 to all copy. A calm reply walked back times, and route. Sirens outside thickened, no longer decoys but the city arriving. Can one call change everything? The thought steadied her hands. Kane lifted his remote again. A rolling door screamed open toward the tracks. Cold rushed in with the throb of an idling locomotive. He stepped onto the catwalk, pistol high. Chase and lose, he called, cutting toward a stair. Daniel tracked slats, moved to intercept. A guard swung a pipe. Shadow darted under, dragged him down by the sleeve. Emma kicked the pipe away, and zip-tied her wrists with a tote strip. Left door, Daniel said, already moving. Emma followed with a warmed bundle. The reek curdled the air. Strobes gnawed sight. They punched into a narrow hall veined with duct. Kane fired blindly behind him, shots tearing cinder block. Daniel advanced by angle and pause, giving Emma space to tuck into a doorway when rounds snapped. The stair broke onto a loading apron where sleet slashed sideways. A pickup idled under a canopy, door open. Kane faced the threshold with a smile that never reached his eyes. Next train's mine, he said, and hurled a flash. Light burst, sound punched, vision whited, then tunneled. Shadow recovered first, barreled through the glare for the moving blur. Teeth found coat, tore cloth, missed flesh. Kane slammed the door, yanked the shifter and fishtailed into the yard. Units screeched into the far entrance. Officers split lanes, took cover, and moved toward cages with blankets and calm voices. Medics followed with warmer. Emma pressed the bundle to her chest, and guided nurses to the silent carriers. These first. Daniel stumbled into the wind. Blue pulses, breath plumes, and radio chatter converged. He fed the plate, then pivoted back inside. Work remained. Shadow posted between open cages and the door while medics triaged. Emma handed off her bundle, grabbed cutters, and freed the last latch. Tiny fists flexed. A medic tucked skin to skin and ran. Kane's truck hammered over a switch, clipped a bumper and swerved toward the gate. A unit chased and lost grip on black ice. The truck punched through a sagging panel and vanished into the grid. Daniel met Emma at the office. She pointed at a map, routes spidering across the city with symbols they knew too well. He won't burn this, she said. Daniel photographed every inch, bagged ledgers, a drive and tags. A new cry flared behind a stack. Shadow pawed a wedged carrier. Emma slid in, lifted the tiny form and tucked the face into her collar. Warmth moved back into the world. Sirens swelled to a chorus. Fire crews killed alarms, drove smoke with fans. Strobes died. The room steady. Officers formed a chain toward the ambulances. A detective clapped Daniel's shoulder. We'll hunt him. Daniel looked through the loading door at rails, where steam Kane had slipped into the streets, yet the warehouse now held names, routes, and children alive in warm arms. He stood in wet boots, wrapped wrists, burned throat and listened as breath returned to small chests. One by one, Shadow leaned into his leg. Emma stepped beside him, damp hair, smudged face, alert eyes. He ran, she said. For now, Daniel answered, turning toward cages carried out under careful hands. The map rolled for evidence, and the door where wind barged, but felt less cruel. The raid closed one chapter and opened another, not with a neat bow, but with sirens riding toward hospitals and a man named Victor. Kane disappearing into the night without victory, only evidence techs hustled in with kits, bagging casings, swabbing railings, lifting prints from door plates, and the remote Kane dropped near the stairs. Daniel dictated the chain of custody, voice even at last, naming each item while medics counted heartbeat. Emma collected phones the guards had tossed, powered them down, and marked each with time and place. A mother from a shelter, drawn by lights, stopped at the tape and whispered a prayer that slid under the noise and stayed. Shadow nosed a line of tiny caps into a neat row, then sat as if to keep watch over what had been claimed back. Morning wheat light pooled across clean bandages while monitors stitched calm beeps that felt almost like breathing for him. Daniel Hayes lay still, letting warmth cradle bruised ribs and raw wrists. Antiseptic floated with coffee from the hall. 2 rooms away, the rescued infant slept under careful watch, numbers steady, skin pink, tiny hands uncurling like leaves. Emma Riley eased through the doorway with Shadow at heel, hair brushed, hoodie zipped, shoes new from a community closet. She carried a paper sack and a nervous grin. "Breakfast," she said, placing an orange, a burrito split in half and napkins folded square, and an update. Daniel lifted an eyebrow. "Your uncle's house on Juniper opened with the spare," she continued. "Porch swing leans, 1 chain is stretched. I measured links, we can fix it after discharge." Shadow set his chin on the mattress, eyes scanning lines, nose sorting all the smells, saline gauze, lemon cleaner, warm formula. Vega, the nurse, checked pressure, smiled at Emma, scratched Shadow behind one ear and whispered, "Strong team." Later, discharge papers clicked and a chaplain offered a short prayer for wisdom and peace that outlasted sirens. Daniel accepted the blessing the way a tired runner accepts water, gratefully, without talk. The house felt smaller than memory and better than any temporary room. A sagging porch, a quiet yard, a kitchen with stubborn drawers, home, imperfect and honest. Emma mapped the floor with soft steps, testing creaks. Shadow patrolled windows, then relaxed only when the kettle sang. They started with the swing. Daniel measured, Emma held the level and Shadow supervised. Screws bit fresh wood, a new chain lifted true and the glide turned from scrape to whisper. Emma sat, rocked once, and beamed in a way that reached places pain could not. Enrollment came next. A principal with silver hair listened first, then arranged placement while documents caught up. A social worker brought supplies that appeared without comment, pencils, notebooks, and a simple backpack. Emma wrote her name on a paper tab, letters leaning forward as if already underway. Mornings gathered on the porch with cocoa and coffee. Homework was found on the kitchen table. Physical therapy stretched Daniel's patience and shoulder discipline, one more often than Emma read picture books to the infant during supervised visits, voice steady, touch gentle. Shadow waiting in the hallway like a sentinel who believed in story time. Meanwhile, detectives pulled threads, ledgers, maps, phones, chalk symbols, pieces joined into a picture a court could weigh. Ellen Harper testified without drama, describing nights when efficiency replaced care and doors clicked on hinges oiled by fear. She did not excuse herself, she stood in light and named what she had seen. Sentencing came with winter sun and breath like steam. The courtroom smelled of varnish and coffee. Reporters lined the back, families filled benches and held each other's hands. Victor Kane remained at large, but lieutenants faced the bench. Daniel sat behind the rail, scars fading to pale lines. Emma wore a borrowed dress. Shadow waited with an officer outside, tail thumping every time the door opened, as if courage could be timed to hinges. The judge read counts slowly, then delivered terms that anchored men who had drifted their lives toward harm. Evidence lay along a table without spectacle, lark-stitched blankets, tagged ledgers, cheap phones, maps with routes traced like veins. When the final number landed, the room exhaled. No cheering, only relief that sounded like chairs scraping, sleeves brushing cheeks, and whispers of thanks. Outside, Daniel steered Emma away from microphones toward sunlight and bus noise and pigeons fanning wings. Shadow pressed his head into her hands, reading relief before words. Days began to stack, not like bricks but like quilt squares, each stitched to the next. The porch swing held spelling lists, chess, and comfortable silence. Daniel learned a chili that tasted like patience. Emma learned streets that felt safe. Shadow learned bell schedules, and the difference between playground shrieks and trouble. Sunday mornings brought hymns shaped like rivers. No one demanded testimony, the music did its work anyway. The infant grew stronger, then louder. Meetings charted a path toward a home prepared with caution and hope. Daniel attended every session he could, even when duty called. Emma knitted tiny caps with Ellen, laughing when first attempts unraveled, trying again until stitches held. Together they built a crib in the garage, sanding edges smooth. Love, they decided, would never be rationed by roofline. Some nights memory rolled like freight over track joint. Daniel stepped onto the porch, let the cold air open his lungs and prayed with plain words. He thanked God for ordinary heroes, a child who refused to freeze, a dog with steel on his tongue and gentleness in his jaw, a nurse who traded delay for truth, neighbors who brought tools without taking control. Grace, he learned, was not an ending, it was fuel to rise and serve again. Emma stretched taller. She brought home a perfect attendance certificate and a ribbon from a story contest judged by retired teachers who valued clear sentences and an honest heart. She read on a small stage that smelled like tempera paint and floor polish. Daniel clapped too hard. Shadow waddled under the microphone cord and leaned into her knees exactly when tears tried to start. Spring painted branches lime. They oiled the swing before squeaks returned, planted tomatoes and marigolds in a cedar box and coaxed basil along the warm step. Homework wrestled with fraction. Evening skies guessed at rain. Through it all they practiced a language built from service, trust and small laughter that felt like stitching torn cloth. The precinct kept a wall of faces not as trophies but as prayers. Daniel touched that display before every shift, a vow renewed. Keep going. He mentored rookies to read alleys, respect labyrinths, and resist the arrogance that turns protection into theater. Move quietly, he told them. Tell the truth. Let mercy set the finish. One afternoon Ellen arrived with a pie whose crust looked like a quilt. She stayed for coffee, sat on the swing and laughed without flinching when the wind rattled chimes. Emma slipped her a drawing: pine trees, a cabin window, chalk symbols crossed by sunlight, history, acknowledged, shame, refused, work, ongoing. Summer edged forward. Juniper Street performed neighborhood theater, scooters, trumpet scales and an old man watering roses at dawn. Blessing hid in ordinary corners, not because pain evaporated but because love kept showing up with sleeves rolled. On a blue evening Daniel said, "We will keep choosing one another." Emma placed her hand over his scarred wrist and squeezed once. Shadow exhaled a long, satisfied sigh that sounded like agreement. The swing held, the house held, their promise held. Justice did not erase scars, yet faith threaded through every day like quiet light under a door. Miracles, they learned, rarely shouted. They arrived as opened locks, steady friends, answered calls and courage borrowed in the exact minute it was needed. God, Daniel believed, works through ordinary hands that choose love when fear insists on silence. That was enough to. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs hope. Type amen in the comments, and subscribe for more stories of courage.